So with all these features added, let's make sure that we can click on a single item here and load it in the recipe details section. Again, this is the challenge for you. It only uses tools we learned thus far. You somehow need to emit an event on the single recipe item component that it was clicked, and then get this event somehow to the recipes component, which then also holds the recipe detail, to pass down the event data, which recipe was selected, to that component. Now you're going to have to work with property and event binding for this. Again, only things you learned thus far. And if you're getting stuck or something like this, of course, we will solve it together in a couple of seconds. Here's your chance to pause. So, were you successful? Now, the approach we're going to follow now, is only a temporary approach. We'll later learn how to do this more elegantly and easier. But it's also a great approach because it uses the things we learned thus far, and it gives us an impression on when a different approach might be useful. So what's our goal? Here in the single recipe item component, here we got this link. And we want to make sure that whenever this link is clicked, we emit an event informing our parent component that this recipe was selected. So for this to work, I'll add a click listener to this link, and I will say on selected here. Of course, you can choose any method name you want. I'll implement on selected here, and there I want to emit my own event. So I will name it recipe selected, and this will use the event emitter as you learned. Again, make sure to import it from @AngularCore. The event emitter here won't pass any information, so I'll set the type to void because it will contain no information. And we have to add @output so that we can listen to this event from outside. @output also needs to be imported from @AngularCore. In onSelected, I then want to trigger recipe selected and call emit. Nope, not error, emit. Again, we don't pass any error because here we specified that we won't. We don't need to pass any. You could argue that you want to pass the recipe on which this was emitted, but you don't need to do this because what is the parent component listening to that? That, of course, is our recipe list component. That is where we use the single recipe item. Now, if we implement our own event here and listen to recipe selected, well, we already got the information which recipe this will be because we have it here from the ng-for loop. Keep in mind, this will replicate this element, so for each element, it's absolutely clear, well, which element this is. In recipe selected, we again need to emit an event though, because we're not there where we want to be. We have to go up one level because we want to reach our recipes component, which is the one implementing the recipe list. This is probably where you see that this is kind of complex to simply inform another component that we clicked something. For now, it's the only method we have, and it's a great practice, but no worries, we will improve this in the future. So in recipe list, we need to emit another event. So here I'll execute on recipe selected. Of course, choose any name you want. And that method, of course, has to be implemented here. Now here we need to get some extra information, which recipe was selected. And therefore, I will pass the recipe element here. So that is the recipe which we did select. Now that we have that information, we know here we will get the selected recipe, which will be of type recipe. We're already importing the model, therefore we can easily use the type. And then we, as I mentioned, want to emit another event. So here we need to find a fitting name. Before we used recipe selected, that would be a fitting name here too. But to make it super clear that this is a different event, because custom events don't propagate up, so we can't listen to the event of a child, I want to choose a different name, recipe was selected maybe, which also uses the event emitter, so make sure to import it from @AngularCore. And here I will pass my recipe as a type. Here I will pass the recipe which was selected because that is the information the recipes component will need in the end. Now, as before, we need to add output here and import this from @Angular core so that we can listen to this event from outside. And then here in onRecipeSelected, we can use recipe was selected emitted and pass the recipe as data. Now with that, we can go to our recipe component, our main component for this feature area. And on the list, we can now listen to recipe was selected, the custom event we created a second ago. And here, I now want to store this selected recipe. So in my TypeScript file, I will create a selected recipe property, which will be of type recipe. Make sure to import recipe from your model file then. And initially, this is undefined because I'm not assigning a value. I will assign a value here once this event here occurs. So then I will set selected recipe equal to $event. And of course, you could also put this into a method, but since this is all I want to do, I can put it into the template here. Generally though, you should try to put as little logic as possible into your template. So here I'm referring to the selected recipe property of my recipes component, and $event, as you learned, refers to the data we passed with an event. Now we can pass this information to the recipe detail component. First of all though, I will add ngIf to this detail component to determine if we want to display it, because I only want to display it if selected recipe is set. So here I will check if selected recipe, and if it is undefined, that will resolve to false. And if it is not set, I want to say a dummy text, so I will use ngTemplate for this to define a paragraph where I say, please select a recipe. And ngTemplate will receive a local reference of info text. And now with that placed on ngTemplate, we can use this ngIfElse syntax where I add a semicolon and then else info text, so that else the content of this template should be displayed. If we save this, we see please select a recipe here. So that is working as it should. Now if we select a recipe by clicking here, we see the recipe detail. Now of course we don't see the detailed data because we're right now not passing this recipe down to the component, but at least our if check is working and we're passing the recipe, this event, successfully. Now as a final step, let's pass the selected recipe to the app recipe detail. For that we have to go to that component and add a property for this. Here I'm going to name this recipe again, which will be of type recipe, so make sure to import this from your recipe model file. It's not set initially, but I will add input so that we may set it from outside. Input, of course, as always, has to be imported from @Angular core. And with that, we can now go back to the recipes component and bind to that recipe. And of course, we want to bind our selected recipe. And keep in mind, this whole component will only be rendered, only be attached to the DOM if this condition is true. So if selected recipe is not undefined. Therefore, once we pass this down to the recipe detail component, we know that we can safely output the recipe name here. So recipe name. Keep in mind, recipe is the property name in this component, the one to which we're binding to from outside. And this will never fail because recipe will always be set, otherwise this component wouldn't be rendered due to ngIf. Here I also want to use property binding to display my image. So recipe image path then. And here I'll use string interpolation to display the name if we can't load the image for some reason. The buttons are fine, but below in the description, I will set recipe description. Now with this, if we save that and we click on the recipe, we see the recipe here. Now the image is a little bit too big, so maybe on this image, let's simply add some styling to it, an inline style, where we set the maximum height to 300 pixels maybe, like that. Now with that, that looks better. So now we got this working. Looks like nothing changed because we got the same text here. So let's quickly go to our recipe list component and name this another test recipe so that we can actually see if we correctly switch. And we do. So that is working. The missing piece now is the shopping list where I want to make these input fields here work, at least in a basic way.